The logging truck's engine roared like a rolling thunderstorm behind me, diesel fumes curling into the cold morning air as the driver revved it twice, waiting for my signal. And in front of my gate sat Karen's gleaming white Range Rover like a smug animal, daring me to move it, its hazard lights blinking defiantly, even though I had already warned her 3 times this week alone. In that moment, the entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, neighbors peeking from curtains, phones raised, knowing something outrageous was about to happen. Because for months I had been patient, documenting everything. But today patience had snapped like a dry branch under my boot, and the only way left to protect my land, my animals, and my sanity was to show her in a way she would never forget. 2 days earlier, life on my ranch had been calm, the usual sunrise coffee on the porch, and the sound of my goats knocking their horns against the fence post. I had bought this land 10 years ago, far outside the city limits, believing that distance meant peace. But the creeping HOA had extended its reach like ivy, absorbing neighboring subdivisions and claiming authority over properties they had no right to manage. Karen was the queen bee of that HOA, a woman with designer sunglasses, tan lines, and a voice that could peel paint when she was denied anything she wanted. The first time she parked her Range Rover in front of my gate, it had seemed accidental. An emergency, she claimed, and I let it go, opening my gate sideways and maneuvering my truck around. But then it became a pattern. Every morning, the same white SUV angled across my driveway like a barricade, forcing me to delay feed runs and livestock deliveries. Each time followed by her breezy apology about phone calls or emergencies. At first, I thought she was targeting me out of convenience. But then came the letters, official-looking HOA notices accusing me of zoning violations, unsightly farm equipment and unauthorized fencing, all of which were legal and properly permitted. It didn't take long to see the pattern. She wanted access to my property as a shortcut for her private walking trail, and when I refused, she began her petty siege. I started keeping a journal and installed dash cams on every vehicle, capturing every second of her Range Rover blocking my gate, and soon had an archive of 50 separate incidents with timestamps and weather conditions. When I showed some of this footage to the county deputy, he sighed and admitted Karen had friends in the county offices, the kind of friends who could make code inspections appear overnight. But he told me if I kept documenting and stayed calm, eventually her luck would run out. In the meantime, Karen escalated, calling animal control on my goats, filing noise complaints about my rooster, even showing up during a feed delivery to harass the driver about his truck idling on public property, which was in fact my own gravel driveway. It reached a breaking point when she blocked my logging contractor. I had hired them for legitimate forestry work on my backlot, clearing dead timber to reduce fire risk. They brought a convoy of massive trucks and chainsaws, and on the first morning of their work, Karen parked her Range Rover squarely across the access gate at 6:01 a.m., folded her arms, and filmed herself like she was starring in a reality show about catching violators. The logging crew, tough men used to mountains and chains, stood slack-jawed, unsure how to proceed without breaking the law. I called the sheriff again, documenting everything, and told Karen politely she was trespassing and obstructing a permitted operation. She smirked and said, "Take me to court." That night, under the low hum of my porch light, I drafted a new plan. I double-checked my easement rights, called the county to confirm that emergency vehicle and contractor access was legally protected, and then phoned the logging company to warn them what might happen. The driver of the biggest truck, a man named Roy, laughed a deep mountain laugh and said, "If she's in the way, we'll move her or the sheriff will, your call." I didn't sleep much that night, replaying the last few months in my head. Every insult, every false report, every goat locked behind a blocked gate without feed because Karen thought her SUV was a throne. By dawn, I had made up my mind. The next morning arrived like the opening of a stage play, the sky pale blue and the ground damp from a misty rain. Karen's Range Rover was already there, hazard lights flashing, a coffee cup on her dash, phone in hand as she filmed herself blocking my gate. I could almost hear her narration, claiming some invented violation as her justification. I stepped out onto the gravel, felt the crunch under my boots, and looked at Roy in the logging truck, a monstrous machine with reinforced bumpers designed to carry tons of timber. Behind him stretched 2 more trucks, chains and cranes ready for work, all idling like impatient giants. Neighbors had gathered at the edge of the cul-de-sac, sensing a showdown. Some sympathetic, some secretly cheering her on, all of them ready to record. I raised my hand to Roy, not yet signaling but steadying him, and then walked up to Karen's window. She rolled it down halfway, a tight smile plastered across her face. "You can't bring these trucks here," she said. "This is HOA property," I replied quietly. "This is my driveway. You're trespassing. Please move your vehicle." She laughed like a villain in a soap opera and raised her phone higher. "Go ahead, push me. The internet loves bullies getting caught." In that instant, I realized she thought she was untouchable, that her social media presence and her friends in the county gave her an invisible shield. But she didn't know I had spent the last week securing every permit, every signature, every legal pretext needed to break that illusion. I took a slow step back, turned to the crowd, and spoke loudly enough for every phone to capture. "For the record, I have requested the vehicle to be moved. It's obstructing lawful contracted work on private property. Sheriff's office has been notified." Roy's foot hovered over the clutch, the logging truck rumbling like a caged bull. I could see the sheriff's cruiser down the road, creeping closer, lights off but present, waiting to witness the line being crossed. In that tense silence, I remembered all the mornings she'd made me late to the feed store, all the times she'd called inspectors to harass me, all the photos she'd taken of my license plates, and I felt the weight of every insult and every lie compress into one moment. The diesel engine coughed another cloud of smoke. Roy leaned out his window and said, "Your call, boss." Karen tapped her phone screen like a trigger, smirking. I raised my hand halfway. Not yet a full signal, but enough to shift the crowd's anticipation into a collective gasp, the kind of moment people replay in slow motion later. That was where chapter 1 of my story really began, with the trucks lined up. The crowd gathered, and Karen still believing she could win a war she had already lost, and me standing at the center, ready to end months of harassment, with one decisive act that would echo across the HOA like thunder on a mountaintop, the moment after that tense standoff with the logging truck and Karen's. Range Rover didn't resolve itself quickly. It unfolded into a complicated dance of power plays, phone calls, and neighborhood whispers that colored the next week of my life. Chapter 2 of this saga began the morning after, when the adrenaline from nearly signaling the truck to move her vehicle had faded into a steady determination to prove that everything she was doing was part of a deliberate campaign of harassment. I woke up before dawn as usual to tend to my animals and check my perimeter cameras, and as the sun rose over the distant hills, I saw her SUV parked across from my gate again, not blocking it this time, but clearly there to monitor me. It was like she was daring me to make the first wrong move so she could spin it as aggression. Instead of reacting impulsively, I decided to build the most airtight case anyone had ever seen in this town. I downloaded weeks of dash cam footage, drone clips, sheriff call logs, and even the inspector reports from the county website. I created a timeline of every single time Karen had interfered with my property rights. By the time I was done, the table in my barn office was covered in printed sheets, maps with pins, and an organized binder with tabs. When my friend Mark, a local truck driver who often stopped by for coffee, saw the setup, he whistled and said it looked like I was hunting a serial offender. In a way, I was. Meanwhile, Karen seemed to sense that I wasn't rattled anymore, which only made her escalate her theatrics. She would stage little performances, pretending to call emergency services while filming herself at my gate, claiming livestock were loose or that I was violating noise ordinances. Of course, none of it was true, and my cameras captured her fabricating these scenes. But to the untrained eye on social media, she probably looked like a heroine standing up to a lawless rancher. The neighbors, however, weren't buying it anymore. The morning after the logging truck standoff, Daniel and Priya, the young couple from down the road, approached me at the feed store and quietly said they supported me. They even shared footage from their own security camera showing Karen's SUV blocking my driveway multiple times. They were scared of retaliation but tired of her controlling the narrative. Their footage became another piece in my expanding case file. By midweek, I had begun filing formal complaints with the county commission, attaching the evidence and requesting a review of the HOA's overreach into non-HOA land. I learned that my property had been incorrectly included in a zoning overlay that gave the HOA some leverage it shouldn't have had. A clerk at the county office confirmed, off the record, that Karen had been pressuring officials for months to formalize an easement across my driveway for emergency access that just happened to coincide with her shortcut to the hiking trail. I felt a grim satisfaction as the pieces fell into place. All those phony complaints, all the intimidation tactics, they were part of a larger plan to force me into ceding a strip of my land. Armed with that knowledge, I drafted a cease and desist letter with the help of a friend who worked at a legal aid clinic, citing trespass, obstruction of commerce, and interference with contracted work. I sent copies to the HOA board, the sheriff's office, and the county attorney. The very next day, Karen appeared at my gate with 2 other board members trying to deliver a formal HOA citation for unauthorized commercial activity on my land. I stood there calmly, holding my copy of the county permit, and explained that logging my own trees was not commercial activity, but private land management. One of the board members looked embarrassed. The other looked scared. Karen's face went red as she realized she was losing her grip on the story she had spun, but the harassment didn't stop overnight. That evening, my phone buzzed with a notification from one of my cameras. Karen had parked again, this time across the street, and was pacing with her phone, probably narrating a new video. The sound of my goats bleating carried through the dusk, a reminder of why I was fighting this battle. I went inside, made a pot of coffee, and sat down with my binder of evidence, thinking through my next move. The key to winning wasn't a single dramatic gesture, but a relentless pattern of preparation and escalation backed by fact. I also started reaching out to local journalists, sending them a packet of public documents showing how the HOA was attempting to annex land it had no jurisdiction over. One reporter from a small but scrappy paper called me back. We spoke for nearly an hour about property rights, local corruption, and the strange standoff at my gate. Meanwhile, Karen tried another angle. 2 days later, she organized a community cleanup day and set up a tent right on the edge of my property line, using it as a pretext to have volunteers and cars clog my driveway. This time, instead of confronting her directly, I called the sheriff, showed the deputy the maps and the cease and desist letter, and let them handle it. The deputy ordered the tent taken down, and several volunteers left embarrassed, realizing they had been roped into her feud. That small victory sent a ripple through the neighborhood. People began whispering that maybe Karen wasn't invincible after all. That same week, I reinforced my gate with a new locking system and posted a clearly worded sign citing state statutes about trespassing and obstruction. I wasn't trying to provoke her, but I wanted every inch of my boundary to be unambiguous. The logging company appreciated the clarity, too, setting their arrival times for later in the morning when a deputy could be present. Roy, the logging truck driver, became almost like an ally, texting me updates on his schedule and joking about bringing popcorn for the next showdown. Even as the tension thickened, I found moments of humor in the absurdity. Karen had once accused my rooster of violating a noise ordinance because he crowed at dawn. She actually filed a complaint listing unlicensed avian alarm clock as a nuisance. Toward the end of that week, the county inspector, who had once been skeptical of me, came back for a follow-up. This time, he was cordial, even friendly, and admitted offhand that Karen had called his office dozens of times about me, but never provided substantive proof of any violation. He seemed impressed by how organized my permits and documents were. Before leaving, he said he'd note in his report that my property was fully compliant and my logging operation legitimate. That single remark was like a crack in Karen's armor. Without the inspector's implicit support, her complaints would carry far less weight. In the evenings, I would walk the perimeter of my land, the air cool and dry, thinking about how surreal it had become that a simple act of buying a ranch had turned into a miniature war with a neighborhood tyrant. Yet beneath the frustration, there was a growing sense of resolve. The community was watching. The sheriff was watching. The media was starting to watch. By the time the weekend arrived, my case file was complete, my legal notices served, and my contractors briefed. The next phase would be decisive. Karen didn't realize yet that every move she made was feeding into a narrative she couldn't control. Soon there would be a public confrontation, not just between her and me, but between her invented authority and the actual law. In my mind, I could already see how it might go. The trucks arriving, the cameras rolling, the sheriff present, and Karen still blocking the gate, convinced she was untouchable. The image played over and over in my head like a chess player imagining the endgame before the first move. That was the essence of Chapter 2 of this story, the slow tightening of a net woven from patience, preparation, and the quiet determination to stand my ground until the moment was right. As the sun crept up over the ridge and the mist rolled off the pastures, Chapter 3 unfolded like a slow chess match. in which every piece on the board was alive and twitching. By now, the pattern of harassment had been documented beyond question. The sheriff's office had a stack of reports, and my binder was overflowing with evidence. But that didn't stop Karen from trying to find new angles. She had moved from crude blockades and staged emergencies to more subtle tactics like sending anonymous letters to the county or trying to smear me on social media. Unlike before, I was no longer reacting in the moment. I was orchestrating a counteroffensive. Each morning before tending to the animals, I sat at my desk, coffee steaming, flipping through land records and legal codes like a man studying an opponent's weaknesses. I discovered a flaw in the HOA's charter where the boundary descriptions were vague and contradictory, a flaw that would be key to undermining their claim over my driveway. I also learned from Blake, the retired surveyor, that Karen had bullied her way into power by threatening lawsuits against anyone who opposed her. Blake provided me with copies of internal HOA emails and meeting notes showing that for years Karen had been lobbying to seize a right-of-way across my property under the guise of improving emergency response times. Armed with this knowledge, I began working with Carl, the lawyer, who specialized in land disputes. Carl advised me to keep collecting evidence and prepare for an injunction if Karen escalated again. That injunction became my quiet weapon, a piece of paper in draft form that could be filed the moment she crossed the line. Meanwhile, I made sure to maintain normalcy on my ranch, feeding the goats, repairing the fences, and greeting neighbors politely. It was a strange dual life, tending animals in the dawn light, and then inside the barn office, poring over legal documents. Carl came out to the ranch to review the access points himself. We stood by the main gate where Karen's Range Rover had sat so many times, and he shook his head, muttering that he had seen some audacious HOA behavior, but this was off the charts. We walked the perimeter, measuring the property lines with a handheld GPS to confirm the survey markers. Everything matched my deed perfectly. It was clear that Karen's claims had no basis in reality, but she was betting on intimidation and fatigue. While the legal groundwork was solidifying, I also took practical measures. I replaced the old wooden gate with a heavier steel one, set deeper into concrete footings, and installed a new cattle grid so even if she tried to block the entry again, the logging trucks could roll up right behind her. I also coordinated with Roy and his crew to ensure their arrival times were staggered, reducing the window of opportunity for Karen to interfere. Roy and I developed hand signals and a plan for documenting every second of any future confrontation, including calling the sheriff ahead of time to stand by if needed. These preparations gave me a quiet confidence, and with confidence came a sense of humor about the absurdity of the situation. Karen, however, seemed to sense that her usual tactics were losing power. She began showing up at county meetings where my permit renewals were posted, trying to make speeches about reckless land clearing and wildlife corridors while waving screenshots from my social media showing tractors and chainsaws. She tried to frame me as a villain destroying nature. But then, in an unexpected twist, one of the county environmental officers spoke up and said my project was actually improving fire safety and had been done in consultation with a state forestry expert. The room went silent. Karen's face froze in a brittle smile while her usual allies stared at their phones. I sat quietly in the back, letting the officer's words hang in the air. That was the day I knew the tide had turned. At home that evening, I received a call from Daniel and Priya, the young couple who had given me their footage. They said Karen had stopped speaking to them and was hinting they might be violating some obscure HOA landscaping rule. They were nervous, but also vindicated. I reassured them, saying that once this was over, the HOA might be forced to change leadership or even face dissolution, and that they weren't alone. Around the same time, the local journalist I had spoken with published a feature article about the Battle of the Gate, describing the saga without names, but with enough details that everyone knew who was who. The article went viral locally, and soon my phone was buzzing with calls from other landowners facing similar HOA overreach. Some of them offered to testify on my behalf if the matter went to court. Karen's narrative was unraveling, and she responded the only way she knew how, by doubling down. She staged a safety drill with a few HOA volunteers parking cones near my driveway and claiming they were testing emergency response routes. It was clearly another pretext to block access, but this time I was ready. I called the sheriff, and within 20 minutes a deputy arrived, saw the cones, and ordered them removed, citing the cease and desist letter. Karen sputtered about her rights, but the deputy cut her off, saying she was on private property without consent. Neighbors recorded the entire scene. After that incident, Carl filed the injunction we had prepared, formally asking the county court to prohibit Karen and the HOA from blocking my driveway or interfering with contracted work. The judge granted a temporary order pending a hearing, essentially giving me legal teeth to back up my warnings. Karen received the papers at her doorstep, and according to Priya, she threw them into her recycling bin without opening them. But even she had to know the game had changed. Meanwhile, the logging company's work on my backlot was progressing. Each day, huge trunks were hauled out, stacked neatly for milling, the trucks moving in and out with military precision. Roy would sometimes pause to chat with me, shaking his head at Karen's persistence. "She's going to push it one too many times," he'd say, tapping the side of his truck. I knew he was right, and that day was coming soon. Karen's next move was to weaponize public opinion. She contacted a regional TV station and invited them to film a story about environmental destruction on my property. The reporter showed up one afternoon while we were hauling logs, camera rolling, expecting to capture a villain, but instead found a well-permitted forestry operation with deputies on site and an owner who calmly produced documentation. I walked the reporter through the property, showed him the signed permits, the erosion control measures, even the letters from the state forestry expert. By the end of the tour, his tone had shifted from accusatory to bemused, realizing he was being used as a pawn. That evening, the segment aired, but it was an awkward puff piece that showed Karen making wild claims while the facts contradicted her. Social media, which she had relied on to rally support, turned against her, mocking the Range Rover blockade and calling her the HOA Queen of Meltdowns. This public embarrassment only made her more erratic. 2 days later, she parked her SUV across my gate again, this time chaining herself to the door handle with a bicycle lock and waving a folder of papers she claimed were new legal documents. I didn't even approach her. I called the sheriff, who arrived with bolt cutters, served her with another citation, and warned her that continued violations could lead to arrest. Roy filmed the entire scene from the cab of his truck, the diesel engine idling like a giant waiting for a signal. Karen screamed about injustice and conspiracies as the deputy calmly cut the chain and guided her off my property. It was surreal, almost theatrical, but it also marked a turning point. She had gone from manipulative to desperate in front of everyone's cameras. That night, alone on my porch, I considered how far this had gone. I hadn't sought this fight, but it had found me, and now I was living inside a story that had taken on a life of its own. The calls from other landowners, the journalists sniffing around, the neighbors whispering, all of it was swirling around a core conflict between one stubborn rancher and one entitled HOA president. Toward the end of that week, Carl called with news. The court had set a hearing date to make the injunction permanent. And because of her repeated violations and the new evidence, we had a strong chance of not only cementing our protection, but also recovering damages for interference with contracted work. The idea of actually winning in court, not just holding the line but achieving restitution, was both thrilling and sobering. Karen must have sensed the walls closing in because her behavior shifted yet again. She sent a handwritten note, oddly polite, requesting a meeting to negotiate a compromise. The note smelled of perfume and desperation. I didn't respond. Instead, I prepared for the next logging day, the one I knew in my gut would be the breaking point. That morning dawned clear and sharp. The trucks lined up, deputies present, neighbors recording. Karen stood by her SUV, shouting about injunctions she couldn't produce. The deputies confirmed the existing order. Roy's truck growled behind me, the neighborhood silent in anticipation. I raised my hand slowly. The truck eased forward, its bumper touching the Range Rover with a metallic thunk. Karen panicked, fumbling with the wheel, her SUV pinned. Deputies moved in, ordering her out. She screamed and refused until they escorted her away. The SUV sagged on crushed suspension, neighbors whispering, cameras capturing every second. The tow truck arrived, hauling the wreck away like the final prop in a play. That night, for the first time in months, my driveway was empty. No cones, no SUV, no shouting. Just the quiet hum of crickets and the distant bleating of goats. The days that followed were different. Karen was suspended from the HOA, then resigned. Her house went up for sale. Neighbors waved instead of looking away. The HOA board rolled back her rules, even considered dissolving. Carl finalized the permanent injunction and began pursuing damages. The story of the crushed SUV spread online as a symbol of standing up to overreach. Weeks later, a small envelope arrived. Inside was a single note. I was wrong. The handwriting looked like Karen's. No apology, no demands. Just 3 words. I folded it and slipped it into my binder, and that was how it ended. A story that began with a blocked gate closed with silence, with land defended, neighbors freer, and a community finally breathing again.